Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
When my husband cheated on me, he cried and begged for forgiveness. It was one night, never again. I nodded and forgave him. But a month later, he received an envelope from a lawyer. His hands began to shake when he saw, "Good day, dear listeners, it's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled." I used to think I had the kind of marriage other women quietly envied, not in a showy way. We weren't the couple who posted anniversary photos every year with long captions about soulmates and blessings. We were quieter than that, steadier, I thought. Daniel and I had been together for 11 years, married for 8 of them, living in a pale yellow house on Crescent Drive in Asheville, North Carolina, with a vegetable garden I actually tended, and a dog named Biscuit, who slept at the foot of our bed. We had a good life, a real one, the kind built from Saturday morning farmers markets and arguments about whose turn it was to call the plumber and Sunday dinners that ran long because neither of us wanted the conversation to end. Daniel was a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm. I was a high school English teacher. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We had savings. We had plans, a trip to Portugal the following spring, maybe finally finishing the back porch. We talked about adopting a second dog. We were, I believed, fine. Looking back now, I can see exactly where the cracks started. I just didn't want to. It began small, the way these things always do. Daniel started working late more frequently. 2, 3 nights a week, sometimes not home until after 9. He said a big commercial project had come in, tight deadline, the usual chaos. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He'd worked late before. But something about the quality of his lateness changed. He used to call on his way home just to say he was leaving. He stopped doing that. When I mentioned it, he said he'd been distracted, tired, stressed. He kissed my forehead and went to shower. Then came the phone. He'd always been relaxed about his phone, left it on the kitchen counter, never flinched when I handed it to him or glanced at the screen. Suddenly it was always face down, always on silent. He took it into the bathroom. Once, when it buzzed on the nightstand at 11:30 and I instinctively reached for it, he was out of bed before I could blink, snatching it up with a speed that startled us both. He laughed it off. "Work stuff," he said. "You know how Rick is about night messages." I nodded. But I lay there in the dark for a long time after he fell asleep. I started noticing other things. A slight distance in his eyes when we talked at dinner, like part of him was somewhere else. He started going to the gym on Sunday mornings, fine, healthy, good. Except he'd never cared about the gym before. He bought new cologne without mentioning it. He began folding his own laundry, which in 11 years he had never once done voluntarily. None of these things, alone, would mean anything. Together, they formed a shape I recognized but refused to name. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I'd been reading too many sad novels, talking to too many divorced colleagues. I threw myself into grading essays and walking Biscuit and planning the Portugal trip. I kept busy. I kept my eyes on the surface of things because I was terrified of what might be underneath. And then one Thursday night in October, Daniel came home at 11:15. I was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of cold tea, not reading the book open in front of me. He walked in and stopped when he saw me. Something moved across his face. Guilt, I know now, though I called it exhaustion at the time. He sat down across from me. He didn't take off his jacket. He folded his hands on the table and stared at them for a long moment. And then he told me, one night, a woman from the client's firm. It meant nothing. It was a mistake, the worst mistake of his life. It would never happen again. He was so sorry. He was begging me, please. His voice cracked and then broke entirely, and Daniel, who I had never once seen cry in 8 years of marriage, was crying, shaking, his hands trembling on the table between us. "It was one night," he said. "One night, Claire. I swear to God, never again. Never." I looked at him for a long time. I felt something move through me. Not rage, not grief. Something colder and more precise than either. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. His shoulders collapsed with relief. "Okay," I said quietly. "I forgive you." I meant it in that moment. I also meant what I did 1 month later, when a sealed envelope from my attorney arrived at our front door, and I watched Daniel's hands begin to tremble all over again. I didn't sleep that night. Daniel did. He cried himself into some exhausted, relieved, unconscious state around 2 in the morning, his breathing eventually going slow and even beside me. I lay on my side of the bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the particular silence of a house where something has just broken. By 4 o'clock, I had stopped pretending and gotten up. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where he'd confessed, where I'd held his hand, where I'd said the word forgive. And I let myself think clearly for the first time. Not emotionally, clearly. I was a woman who taught teenagers to construct logical arguments, to follow evidence to conclusions. I decided to apply those same skills to my own life. First, what did I actually know? I knew my husband had slept with another woman. I knew he'd said it was once. I knew that men who are discovered rarely confess to more than the minimum. I knew that the changes in his behavior, the phone, the gym, the cologne, the distance, had been building for at least 2 months, possibly longer. One night does not require 2 months of behavioral change. One night does not make a man start hiding his phone from his wife of 8 years. I also knew that I had said the word forgive before I had any idea what I was actually forgiving. Second, what did I stand to lose? We owned the house jointly. We had a shared savings account with $42,000. Money I had contributed to equally, month by month, for 8 years. I had a retirement account in my name, and Daniel had one in his, but we had always talked about them as ours. I had turned down a department head position 2 years ago because Daniel's job required us to stay in Asheville, and I'd been loyal to that decision. I had shaped my professional life around the geography of his career. I had given this marriage my 30s, my best decade of energy, ambition, and possibility. And I had said forgive in 45 seconds while he was still crying. Third, what did I actually want? This question sat in front of me like an unfamiliar object. I turned it over carefully. Did I want to save the marriage? Maybe. If the marriage I thought I had was real, but I was no longer sure it was. Did I want revenge? No. Revenge was messy and expensive and didn't get you anything you could bank. What I wanted, I realized slowly, as the sky outside the kitchen window began to lighten from black to gray, was information and control. Those were the 2 things that had been taken from me. Those were the 2 things I intended to get back. I called in sick to school that morning for the first time in 3 years. While Daniel was in the shower, I went to his home office and photographed every document I could find. Tax returns, bank statements, the mortgage paperwork, his employment contract. My hands were perfectly steady. I wasn't angry. I was focused. Then I called my sister, Renee, who lived in Charlotte, and who had always been the practical one. I didn't tell her everything yet, just that I needed the name of a good divorce attorney. She didn't ask many questions. She gave me a name, Margaret Hollis. She said Margaret was thorough and didn't waste time. I called Margaret Hollis's office that afternoon and made an appointment for the following Tuesday. Then I did something I'd been putting off for weeks. I went through 2 months of our shared credit card statements online. My stomach tightened as I scrolled. 2 dinners at Fleur, a wine bar downtown I'd never been to with him, a hotel charge, the Kimpton, 62 miles from Asheville, for a Friday night in September, when Daniel had told me he was at a work conference in Raleigh, a jewelry purchase at a boutique on Lexington Avenue, a bracelet, I imagined, or earrings, something small and meaningful enough to give. I printed everything and put it in a folder I labeled Household Taxes, 2023, and tucked it at the back of my filing cabinet. That evening, I cooked dinner. Pasta, his favorite. I opened a bottle of wine and smiled across the table and asked him how his day had been. He was warm, attentive, grateful in the way of a man who believes he has been forgiven and is starting fresh. He had no idea that I had already begun. The plan wasn't fully formed yet, more of a direction than a blueprint. But it had a foundation: documentation, legal counsel, and patience. I was going to find out exactly what I was dealing with before I decided what to do about it. In my classroom, I always told my students, don't argue until you have the evidence. Evidence changes everything. I intended to take my own advice. Margaret Hollis's office was on the 4th floor of a brick building downtown, the kind of place that smelled like fresh coffee and quiet competence. Her assistant offered me water when I arrived. I accepted. I was grateful for something to hold. Margaret herself was in her early 50s, with short silver hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain. She shook my hand, sat down, opened a legal pad, and said, "Tell me what's happening." No preamble, no sympathy performance. I appreciated that more than I could say. I told her everything: the confession, the one-night claim, the credit card statements, the hotel charge, the cologne, all of it. She listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small, precise handwriting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The hotel charge alone is significant," she said. "But here's what I need you to understand, Claire. If this goes to divorce proceedings, what matters is documentation. Not suspicion, not gut feeling, documentation. North Carolina is an at-fault state. Adultery is legally relevant here. That means provable adultery can affect property division and, in some cases, alimony." She explained my options with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. We talked about asset protection. She advised me to quietly open an individual checking account and begin transferring a portion of my direct deposit there. Legally. Nothing drastic, nothing concealed beyond what the law permitted. Just building a foundation. She also gave me the name of a private investigator she worked with regularly. His name was Paul Greer. She said he was discreet and methodical and had never once given her inadmissible evidence. "Take your time," Margaret said as I stood to leave. "You don't have to file anything today, but stop waiting for the truth to come to you. Go find it." I thought about that on the drive home. Stop waiting for the truth to come to you. Go find it. I called Paul Greer the next morning. What I didn't know then was that the woman wasn't a stranger from a client firm. Her name was Kristen Mercer. She was 34, a project coordinator at Daniel's company. Not a client, not a one-time encounter from an out-of-town conference. She had worked 15 feet from my husband's office for 2 years. She knew his coffee order and his deadlines and, apparently, a great deal more. I learned this from Paul Greer 11 days after I hired him. He called me on a Wednesday afternoon while I was sitting in my car in the school parking lot, watching students pour out through the front doors. "Ms. Hale," he said, "I have something for you." He had photographs. Daniel and Kristen, leaving her apartment building on a Tuesday evening. The same Tuesday, Daniel had texted me that he was working late and not to wait up. They were not behaving like colleagues. The photographs were clear, legally obtained, time-stamped. He also had something else. A confirmation from the Kimpton Hotel that the reservation in September had been made under Daniel's name for 2 guests. 2 guests. I sat in my car for a long time after I hung up. Students walked past. A girl I'd taught last year waved at me through the windshield. I waved back automatically, my face doing the right things from muscle memory. It wasn't one night. It had never been one night. That was the moment everything clarified. Not the confession, not the credit card statements, not even the phone behavior. This. This was the point from which there was no going back, not because of anger, but because of arithmetic. He had looked me in the eyes. He had held my hand. He had cried. And he had lied. I drove home and made dinner and asked Daniel about his day. He told me about a problem with a subcontractor, and I listened and nodded and refilled his glass. And while he talked, something inside me went very, very quiet. Meanwhile, I would later learn, Kristen had noticed something. She'd mentioned it to Daniel the week before. A feeling, she said. A change in my energy, she called it, apparently having observed me at a company event the previous fall. She told him I seemed different, watchful. Daniel had told her she was imagining it. Claire doesn't do anything, he reportedly said. She'd just be hurt. She's not the type. He believed that, I think. Completely. It was the most expensive mistake of his life. I filed on a Monday. Margaret had prepared everything with the careful precision of someone building a structure meant to withstand weather. The petition cited adultery. Documented, supported by the photographs Paul Greer had provided, and the hotel records and the credit card statements I'd assembled over weeks in my folder labeled Household Taxes. 2023. We also filed for equitable distribution of marital assets, including the house and the joint savings. The process server reached Daniel at his office at 2:14 in the afternoon. I know this because Margaret's assistant called to confirm. I was standing in my classroom at the time, reading a student essay on The Great Gatsby, specifically the passage about the green light, about yearning for something that is already gone. I thought that was fitting. Daniel called me 14 times between 2:14 and 4:30. I let every call go to voicemail. I picked up Biscuit from the neighbor who'd been watching him, drove home, changed into comfortable clothes, and sat on the back porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the garden. When Daniel's car turned into the driveway at 5:15, I was still on the porch. He came around the side of the house, still in his work clothes, the envelope in his hand. His face was a kind of white I'd never seen on him before. He stood at the porch steps and stared at me. Claire. His voice was barely functional. You should call an attorney, I said pleasantly. Margaret Hollis can give you a referral if you need one. You said you forgave me. I did, I said. And then I found out what I actually forgave. Those are different things, Daniel. He started talking. The old language. The language of we can fix this. We can go to counseling. It was a mistake. I ended it. I swear it's over. And I listened to all of it with the patience of a woman who has already made her decision and is simply waiting for the other person to exhaust themselves. I have an early morning tomorrow, I said when he paused for breath. You should stay at your brother's for now. I've already spoken to Margaret about the interim arrangements. He left. I don't think he believed even then that I was completely serious. The call from Kristen came 3 days later. She called my personal cell. I still don't know how she got the number, though I have my suspicions. It was a Thursday evening, just after 7. I answered because I didn't recognize the number. This is Kristen Mercer, she said. Her voice was controlled, the voice of someone who has rehearsed. I think we should talk. About what specifically? I asked. She seemed briefly thrown by my calm. Then she recovered. She said that what I was doing was going to hurt a lot of people unnecessarily. That Daniel and I clearly had problems that existed long before she came along. That dragging this through the courts was vindictive and would destroy his career. And she wasn't going to let that happen. I noticed the phrasing. She wasn't going to let that happen. I appreciate you calling, I said. You should know that this conversation may be relevant to the proceedings, and I'd encourage you to speak with your own attorney before contacting me again. She raised her voice then. She said I was being calculating and cold and that I didn't even really love Daniel. I was just doing this out of ego. She said she knew people. Her family knew people. The kind of people who could make things complicated for me professionally. She wanted me to understand that teaching jobs were not easy to hold on to when there were questions about a person's character and stability. Goodbye, Kristen, I said, and ended the call. I sat for a moment. My heart was beating faster than I would have liked. That was the part I hadn't entirely anticipated, the direct intimidation, the mention of my job. I took 3 slow breaths and then called Margaret and told her about the conversation. She took notes and said it was potentially useful and reminded me to document the call log. After I hung up, I allowed myself to feel the fear properly for about 45 seconds. It was real. It had edges. And then I let it pass. I called Renee and told her I needed a long weekend. She said to come to Charlotte immediately. I packed a bag, put Biscuit in the car, and drove south on I-26 while the sun went down ahead of me, and I played Carole King on the stereo and didn't think about any of it for 3 entire days. I had earned that. Charlotte was good for me in the way that simple things are sometimes the most restorative. Renee lived in a narrow townhouse in Noda with a small terrace and a rotating cast of neighborhood cats that came to beg at the railing. She fed me without fuss. Scrambled eggs, good coffee, pasta on the second night. She asked questions when I wanted to talk and didn't ask them when I didn't. Biscuit sat on her couch and shed enthusiastically on her cushions, and she never once complained. On the second evening, we sat on the terrace and she said, "How are you actually doing?" I thought about it honestly. "Clearer than I've been in months," I said. "Scared sometimes, but clear." "That's enough," she said. "Clear is enough." I believed her. I came back to Asheville on a Tuesday morning. The house felt different without Daniel's physical presence, quieter in a way that was initially unsettling and then, gradually, not. I opened windows. I moved a lamp he'd always put in the wrong corner. Small adjustments. The architecture of a life being rearranged. The text from Daniel came on Wednesday afternoon. Not angry. That surprised me. It was careful, soft, written in the voice of the man I had married rather than the man I had discovered. "Claire, I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I've been thinking about Portugal, about the porch we were going to finish, about how long we built this. I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I'm asking if there's anything left worth fighting for. Please just think about it. That's all." I read it twice. I noticed the specific details he'd chosen. Portugal, the porch. Things that had been ours. Things he knew would land with weight. It was skillful. I won't pretend it didn't touch something, but I also noticed what wasn't in the message. An acknowledgement that he had lied to my face. Not just cheated, lied. Held my hand and cried and told me it was one night, knowing it wasn't. The text was about his loss, his grief, his hope. It was not about what he had actually done. I typed, "I've thought about it." I didn't send anything else. I mentioned the text to Margaret at our next meeting. She noted it. She said Daniel's attorney had been in touch and that he was likely operating under the assumption that the emotional appeal might soften my position before negotiations began in earnest. "Does it?" she asked without inflection. No, I said. What helped, what genuinely helped, was the people I told. I had kept this very private for weeks, which was the right instinct legally and logistically, but it had its cost. Silence about pain has a weight, so I began, selectively, to let people in. I told my closest colleague at school, Diane, a history teacher who'd been divorced herself, and who received the information with a brisk, compassionate practicality that I found enormously comforting. She didn't perform shock. She didn't make it about her. She brought me a casserole on Thursday and sat with me for an hour and talked about the logistics of rebuilding, financially, emotionally, practically, with the matter-of-fact energy of a woman who had been through it and come out the other side. The first year is the hardest, she said, and then it just becomes your life, which is actually fine. I also called my college friend Priya, who was now a family law attorney in Atlanta, not to replace Margaret, just to talk to someone who understood both dimensions. Priya was direct in the way that only old friends who are also professionals can be. She said I was doing everything right. She said the documentation was smart, the timing was smart, and that Kristen's phone call, especially the veiled threat about my job, was potentially very stupid on Kristen's part. That kind of thing tends to come back, Priya said. How so? I asked. Courts and school boards both have long memories, she said, and neither one likes to feel manipulated. I held on to that. By the end of the second week, something had shifted internally. The fear was still there. I don't want to suggest otherwise, but it had been joined by something else. A kind of quiet, load-bearing confidence. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that simply holds. I started finishing the back porch on my own. I bought lumber. I watched tutorials on YouTube. I measured twice, cut once, like my father had always said. It wasn't about the porch. They came on a Saturday. I saw Daniel's car pull up from the kitchen window, and I noticed immediately that there were two people in it. Something moved through my chest. Not surprise, exactly. More like the specific feeling of having a suspicion confirmed. I had not invited Kristen Mercer to my home. I took a slow breath, dried my hands on the dish towel, and went to the front door. I opened it before they reached the porch. I stood in the doorway. Biscuit pressed against my legs but didn't bark. He'd always been a gentle dog. Daniel looked worse than when I'd last seen him. Thinner. There were shadows under his eyes. He was dressed carefully, which I recognized as effort, and he was holding himself with the deliberate composure of someone who had rehearsed his lines the night before and believed rehearsal would be enough. Would be. Kristen was taller than I'd expected. She stood slightly behind him, which I noted. She was wearing a gray coat and no expression that I could read. Claire, Daniel said, thank you for opening the door. Can we come in? We just want to talk. About? I said. About all of this, he said. About. There has to be a way to handle this that doesn't have to be so adversarial. We want to see if we can come to some kind of understanding. I looked at them both for a moment. Then I stepped back and let them in, which surprised them, I think. I had weighed this decision already. Margaret had advised me not to have substantive discussions without her present, but she had also said that observing what they chose to say could be informative. I invited them to sit in the living room. I offered nothing to drink. They sat on the couch. I sat in the armchair across from them, biscuit at my feet. The distance was deliberate. Daniel began. He was careful at first, reasonable sounding, measured. He talked about the mutual cost of contested proceedings. He talked about the house, the savings, how much would be consumed by attorneys. He talked about how neither of us needed to emerge from this destroyed, as he put it. He used the word rational 3 times in 5 minutes, as though framing this as a question of reason rather than consequence would somehow reorganize my priorities. This doesn't have to be a war, he said. We can do this quietly, privately, without the adultery filing. A clean separation, equitable, no one's reputation damaged. I noticed the no one's reputation part. That's one option, I said. Then Kristen spoke. I'll give her this. She was confident. She looked at me directly and said that she understood I was hurt and that my feelings were valid. I noticed how carefully she said that, like she'd read something about empathy as a negotiating tool the previous evening, highlighted key passages, practiced the inflection in a mirror. Then she said that what Daniel and I had was over long before she was involved, that anyone paying attention could see we hadn't been right for each other for years, that I was only pursuing this particular legal strategy out of bitterness, and that it would ultimately hurt me more than anyone else. You're a teacher, she said. This kind of public process, the attention it draws. Are you sure that's something you want attached to your name? There it was, dressed up softer this time, but the same shape as the phone call. My job, my reputation. A threat wearing the costume of concern. I let the silence sit for a moment after she finished. I find that silence, applied correctly, is one of the most useful things a person can deploy. It makes people reveal what they meant to conceal. Kristen, I said, the last time you raised my professional situation, I reported it to my attorney. I want you to know I'll be doing the same with this conversation. Her composure flickered. We're not threatening you, Daniel said quickly. That's not... I know what it is, I said, and I want to be very clear about something. This process will continue exactly as Margaret and I have planned it. The filing stands. The documentation stands. I'm not angry at either of you. I want to be transparent about that, because anger would be exhausting, and I have better uses for my energy. But I'm also not going to change course because you've asked me to, or because Kristen has concerns about my name being in court documents. They looked at each other. The glance between them was quick, communicative, the shorthand of two people who had discussed contingency plans. I saw Daniel give the smallest shake of his head, as if to say, this isn't working. And I told you. You're being vindictive, Kristen said. The pleasantness had dropped entirely now. Her voice had a new edge, clipped, direct, the voice she probably used when she wasn't performing. I'm being precise, I said. There's a difference. You know this destroys him, she said. Is that what you want? To destroy someone you claim to love? I looked at her steadily. I want what I'm legally and rightfully owed, I said. That's all I have ever wanted from this process. You came here today hoping I'd be too intimidated or too sentimental to hold my position. I'm neither. They left shortly after. Daniel didn't say goodbye. Kristen's jaw was tight as she walked to the car, her heels sharp on the porch boards. I watched them go, watched the car pull away without either of them looking back, and then I went inside and stood in the kitchen with my hands braced on the counter. My heart was hammering, but beneath the fear was something else. A clean, bright current of absolute certainty. I was not going to give an inch, not one. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday morning in February in a conference room at Margaret's office building. I arrived 12 minutes early. I wore a navy blazer over a white blouse and a pair of low heels I could walk steadily in, and I brought nothing with me except a notepad and a pen. I had read every document in our file over the preceding 2 weeks. Read them until the dates and the amounts and the locations were as familiar to me as lesson plans I'd taught 20 times. I had nothing to prove and nothing to hide, which is the cleanest position a person can occupy in a room like that. Daniel arrived with his attorney, a man named Graham Fuller, who had a reputation, Margaret had told me, for aggressive posturing and rapid settlements. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who had won enough to assume he would keep winning. Kristen was not present in the room. She had her own separate legal exposure in this. But her shadow was everywhere. Daniel looked at me when he came in. I looked back at him steadily, and then returned my attention to my notepad. I would not give him the relief of an emotional reaction. I had decided that, before I left the house that morning, the deposition proceeded with the methodical rhythm of legal process, which is both tedious and quietly devastating in equal measure. Fuller's strategy became apparent within the first 20 minutes. Minimize the duration, minimize Kristen's relevance, characterize the marriage as already deteriorated before the affair began, position Daniel as a man who had made a single, isolated error in an already failing relationship, and had come forward voluntarily out of honesty and remorse. It was a coherent story. It just wasn't supported by the evidence. Margaret was patient and surgical. She asked questions in the way of someone who already knows every answer and is merely providing the witness the opportunity to contradict them publicly. She introduced the hotel records first. The Kimpton reservation, September 14th. 2 guests. Daniel confirmed his name on the reservation. He said he had taken Kristen there once, early on, before he had ended it. "When did you end it?" Margaret asked. "Before I told Claire, October. I told Claire because I wanted to be honest." "And the relationship between you and Ms. Mercer, when did it begin?" A pause, small but visible. "August," Daniel said. Margaret let that settle. Then she placed a document in front of him. A second hotel reservation. The Cambria in Greenville, July 19th. The silence in the room was very specific, the kind that has weight. "Is that your signature on the registration?" Margaret asked. Fuller leaned in. There was a brief, whispered consultation. Daniel confirmed it. "That would suggest the relationship began in July at the latest," Margaret said pleasantly. "Not August. Is that correct?" Another pause. Longer this time. "We met in July," Daniel said carefully. "The relationship, the romantic aspect, it took a few weeks." "Of course," Margaret said, in a tone that was entirely neutral and somehow devastating. Then she introduced a third document, subpoenaed text message records from Daniel's carrier, spanning July 3rd through October 22nd. 5 pages, single-spaced. The sheer volume told a story before anyone read a word. Daniel's face changed. It wasn't a dramatic change. It was the subtle rearrangement of a man who has run out of runway and knows it. Graham Fuller asked for a recess. During the break, I stood at the window at the end of the hall and looked at the street below. A woman was walking a stroller in the February cold, head bent against the wind. A delivery truck idled at the corner. Ordinary life, proceeding entirely without awareness of the room I was standing next to. How strange, I thought, that the world just continues. How strange and how useful. I thought about the night Daniel confessed. His trembling hands, the wine on the kitchen table. One night, Claire, I swear to God, never again. Never. How much architecture had gone into that performance? How long he must have been preparing it? I felt nothing that surprised me. I had had months to feel things, had done it carefully and privately and in the right proportions at the appropriate times. What I felt now was a very simple, very clean resolve. When we reconvened, Fuller introduced his pivot, the argument about the quality of the marriage prior to the affair, emotional unavailability, Claire's focus on work, disconnection, a relationship already in decline before Kristen entered the picture. It was a predictable tactic, and Margaret had prepared me for it thoroughly. She asked me directly, for the record, "Mrs. Hale, were you aware of any significant marital problems prior to your husband's disclosure in October?" "No," I said. I was planning a trip to Portugal with my husband. I was tending a vegetable garden. I was making dinner. I was, to the best of my knowledge, in a functional marriage. And when did you first suspect your husband was not being truthful about the nature or duration of his relationship with Ms. Mercer? I described it precisely and in sequence. The behavioral changes beginning in late summer, the credit card records, the hotel discrepancy, the conversation with Paul Greer on a Wednesday afternoon in a school parking lot while students walked past my car. I spoke in complete sentences. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the court reporter when I spoke, clearly, so nothing would need to be repeated. Across the table, I watched Daniel's composure come apart. Not dramatically, not in a single moment, but in the slow, irreversible way of something that has lost its structural support. He had built his account on a story. The story no longer held. By the time we finished, the record was complete and unambiguous. 4 months at minimum. Deliberate, repeated deception. 2 hotels. 5 pages of messages. A bracelet. And 1 night at a kitchen table, holding my hand, crying. Margaret gathered her papers with the efficiency of someone entirely satisfied with the day's work. Outside in the February cold, I breathed slowly and let the air fill my lungs completely. I had not broken, not once. The settlement was finalized on a Tuesday in late April. North Carolina family law operates under equitable distribution, which does not automatically mean 50-50. It means fair, and fairness is built from context. Margaret had spent months assembling that context with the care of someone constructing something load-bearing. The documented adultery, the sustained and deliberate deception, the career accommodation I had made 2 years prior, declining the department head position, restructuring my professional ambitions around the geography of Daniel's job. All of it was part of the record. All of it shaped what the court determined was equitable. I received the house, the pale yellow house on Crescent Drive, with the vegetable garden I had planted, and the back porch I had finished with my own hands, and lumber from the hardware store, and tutorials watched on a laptop at the kitchen table. The house was mine. I received 60% of the joint savings account, $32,800, calculated on the basis of the career sacrifice, the disproportionate financial contribution during the period of the affair, and the documented use of marital funds for hotels, restaurants, and a bracelet I had been right to imagine from the first moment I saw the boutique charge on the statement. I received my retirement account in full. Daniel retained his, which was smaller, because he had managed it with the same diligence he had managed everything else. Daniel was ordered to contribute to my attorney's fees. Margaret had anticipated this possibility. I had not permitted myself to hope for it. When she told me, I sat quietly in her office for a moment before I said anything. "All of it?" I asked. "A significant portion," she said. "Yes." I nodded. I looked at my hands. Then I said thank you. And I meant it for everything. The Tuesday meetings, the legal pad, the silver reading glasses, the 12 months of calm, precise, unwavering work. He also lost something that neither Margaret nor I had engineered, but that neither of us had been entirely surprised by. His position at the firm, workplace relationships between supervisors and subordinate coordinators, particularly when they generate litigation, become part of a public legal record and involve the sustained misuse of the professional trust that a senior title carries, have a way of surfacing in the attention of senior partners and HR departments. A partner at Daniel's firm, a man in his 60s with a long memory and firm views about what a company's name should be associated with, reviewed the situation and determined that Daniel's conduct constituted a violation of the firm's professional standards policy. The power differential between a project manager and a coordinator reporting within his chain of influence was a particular concern. Daniel resigned before a formal process could be initiated. I learned this through a mutual friend, not from Daniel, who had stopped contacting me after the deposition. He relocated to Knoxville shortly after, to his brother's house. He was renting a room there, I understood. He had no mortgage, no significant savings remaining after the settlement and the legal fees, and no position at the company where he had spent 12 years building a career. He had Kristen, I supposed, though not for long. Kristen's situation had its own particular and unsentimental logic. Her position at the firm became untenable as well. She submitted her resignation within 2 weeks of Daniel's. The professional disruption, the HR scrutiny, the knowledge that her name was woven into a court record, none of it was survivable in the same building where it had all begun. Whatever she had imagined for herself on the far side of this, Daniel, a new beginning, a version of someone else's life reoriented around her, did not materialize in the form she had envisioned. They were together for a few months after the settlement. I heard this from the ambient information that circulates through a mid-sized city, whether you seek it or not. And then they weren't. The architecture of a relationship built in secret tends to look very different once the secret is gone. The transgression that had bound them, the shared thrill of concealment, the particular intimacy of being someone's hidden life, dissolved when it became public record instead. What remained, apparently, was not quite enough. She moved to Charlotte. I heard this eventually and did not pursue the details. The apartment on the east side of Asheville, the one outside which Paul Greer had taken his time-stamped photographs on a Tuesday evening, had a for rent sign in the window the one time I happened to drive past. I had not driven past deliberately, but I noticed the sign, and I felt something that was not triumph and not satisfaction and not quite relief. It was something quieter than any of those things. The feeling of proportion restored, of a scale that had been tipped violently to one side, settling slowly back to level. The call from Daniel's mother, Carol, came in late May. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman from Knoxville who had always been more clear-eyed about her son than he was about himself, and who had never quite known what to do with that clarity. She called to tell me she was sorry, not on his behalf, on her own, for what I had endured, for how faithfully I had shown up to something that had not shown up for me. I thanked her. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, her garden, a book she was reading, a neighbor's new porch. We have spoken a few times since. It was, in its way, the most unexpected grace of the entire year. Margaret and I met for coffee after the final paperwork was signed. Lexington Avenue, 2 blocks from the boutique. I had chosen the location deliberately, and she had not commented on it, which was exactly right. She said I was one of the most prepared clients she had worked with in 20 years of family law. "You came in ready," she said. "Most people come in hoping. You came in ready." "I teach teenagers to argue from evidence," I said. "Eventually, you start applying it everywhere." She laughed. I laughed. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and made everything briefly golden. I drove home to Crescent Drive with the windows down, my house, my garden coming in, my dog at the door. I sat on the porch I had built and I watched the spring arrive, unhurried, precisely on schedule. The summer after the divorce was the first one I can remember in a very long time where I woke up most mornings without dread. Not without difficulty. I want to be honest about that. There were hard days. Days when I walked through the house and felt the echo of what it had been, when the silence in the kitchen at 7 in the morning had a specific quality that I hadn't yet made peace with. Days when I passed the spot on the couch where Daniel used to sit with his coffee and the Sunday paper, and the absence had a shape I could almost see. Days when I wondered, briefly, whether I had done the right thing. Not because I doubted the decision, but because even right decisions carry weight, and weight is not always comfortable, and comfort is not always a reliable measure of correctness. But the mornings without dread outnumbered those days by a margin that kept growing. And eventually, the margin became so wide that I stopped counting. I accepted the department head position, the one I'd declined 2 years earlier to stay moored to Daniel's geography, to keep our household stable for his career, to be the kind of partner who accommodates. My principal had kept tabs on me. She's that kind of administrator, attentive in the way of someone who tracks people's potential as a professional obligation. And when she heard, through the particular efficiency of a school's internal information network, that my circumstances had changed, she came to my classroom doorway one afternoon in June and leaned against the frame and asked if I was ready. "I think I've been ready for a while," I said. She smiled like someone who had suspected as much. The position came with a modest salary increase and a new set of responsibilities, and an office with a window that looked out over the school's courtyard. Which sounds minor and was not minor at all. It was the first room in that building that was entirely mine, chosen for me, earned by me, belonging to no one else's story. I spent 2 evenings in August arranging it. I put a small plant on the windowsill. I hung a print I'd bought years ago and never found the right wall for. I sat in the chair behind the desk and looked out at the courtyard and felt, in a way I had not felt in longer than I could precisely date, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I adopted a second dog in July. Her name was Georgia. She was a mid-sized hound mix with a deeply serious face and a hilariously undignified relationship with Biscuit, whom she adored from the first afternoon, and bossed around with the cheerful tyranny of someone who has decided another creature is their entire project. The house, which had felt large in all the wrong ways after Daniel left, too quiet in the evenings, too many rooms with no particular reason to enter them, felt full again, differently full than before, but genuinely so. Fully occupied by a life that was actually mine. Renee came for a long weekend in August. We finished the garden properly, the back section I'd been meaning to expand for 2 years, and opened a good bottle of wine on the porch I'd built, and talked until the mosquitoes made staying outside untenable and drove us laughing through the back door. She said I looked 10 years younger. I told her that was hyperbole, and she told me she had a master's degree and knew what hyperbole was, and this wasn't it. Priya drove up from Atlanta in September. We ate at Fleur, yes, that Fleur, the wine bar from the credit card statement, the one Daniel had taken Kristen to twice while telling me he was working late. I had avoided it for nearly a year, and then one morning, I decided that avoidance was a way of letting a place retain a meaning it no longer deserved to hold. We made a reservation. The food was excellent. Priya ordered the salmon. I ordered the duck. We stayed for 3 hours and talked about everything except the divorce, which felt by then like the right proportion of attention to give it. I heard about Daniel through Carol, who called every few weeks, and through the low, ambient current of information that moves through a city of this size, whether you engage with it or not. He had found work eventually, a smaller firm in Knoxville, a meaningful step down in both title and compensation. He was renting an apartment near his brother's neighborhood. He had, according to Carol, become quieter, more careful. She described him with the measured, complicated tenderness of a mother who loves her child and is not blind to what he cost himself. I did not wish him harm. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy and false to perform a bitterness I don't actually carry. But I did not wish him back, either. The man I had loved was real. I still believe that. But he was not the whole of who Daniel was, and the rest of him had made choices I could not have built anything lasting on. Kristen, from what I gathered, had not rebuilt easily. The Charlotte move had been a restart under difficult conditions. No professional network in a new city, a resume with a gap that required explanation, the particular exhaustion of starting over in your mid-30s without the foundation you had imagined you were building toward. I did not follow her story closely. I did not need to. What I understood was simply this: she had wagered on someone else's life and lost, because that is almost always what happens when you wager on something that doesn't belong to you. What changed most profoundly, in the end, was something internal that resists clean articulation. I had spent years making myself smaller in ways I had not recognized as smallness. The accommodations, the compromises, the quiet subordination of my own ambitions to the shape of someone else's needs and geography. I had called all of it love, and some of it was. But some of it was also fear. Fear of disruption. Fear of being difficult. Fear that my own full size might be inconvenient. I was no longer afraid of my own full size. I was teaching books I loved. I was growing tomatoes and eating them warm from the vine in the long summer evenings with Georgia asleep at my feet and Biscuit watching the yard with his customary philosophical calm. I was finishing things I'd started. I was sleeping deeply and waking without the low, unnameable weight that had been sitting on my chest for longer than I had honestly admitted. I was, in the most ordinary and most complete sense of the word, home. Here is what I know now that I didn't know then. Forgiveness and strategy are not mutually exclusive. You can mean both at once without contradiction. I forgave Daniel. I also protected myself. I chose not to mistake kindness for surrender. If someone shows you who they are in the moment they think they've escaped consequences, believe them completely. What would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed? Would you have fought? I'd genuinely like to know. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Subscribe if you want to hear more. And thank you, truly, for listening.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.